we're live. Welcome back to another episode of the Physiology and Philosophy podcast. If you're hearing my voice right now, then you just heard the fire intro that my guy Furpo made for me. So I'm sure it'll continue to adapt and evolve as we move forward here, but just wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Furpo. And if you are in the tri-state area, just look up Furpo on Instagram and go watch him play, and you'll have a fun time. So thank you again. Just wanted to shout you out before we get rolling here. This episode is a very exciting one. It is the first one on the physiology/nutrition side of the podcast. And here I get to interview two very well-established people in the industry, but also two very close friends of mine. And they give their backgrounds in the actual interview, but I just wanted to provide some more context here on both of them because they mean a lot to me, and we dive into some factors related to nutrition that are important but also practical. We covered things like how to construct a diet, how much protein is optimal, is saturated fat something that you should try to stay away from, and if so, in what cases might that be the case. And we really just touch on all the potentially polarizing concepts you could even think about in nutrition. So it's dense, it's long, but I highly recommend listening to the whole thing. If you have to chop it up and listen to it in segments, that's totally fine. But I really enjoyed it, and I enjoy both of these people very much. To start, Christopher Barakat, a fellow Long Islander, when I was a sophomore in college at the University of Tampa, the lab head at the time gave me a piece of paper to run out to a potential student, and it was a recommendation for an internship at, I think it was like Dan and Yogurt. And there, lo and behold, was Chris Barakat for the first time that I met him. And right away, I could just feel his passion and sense just his unwavering interest in all things related to nutrition and altering body composition. And since then, we worked together in the research lab for about, I think, a total of 3 years directly together. And I was doing some projects more in the strength training and sport performance, and Chris was doing some stuff more related to body composition and hypertrophy. And he is without a doubt one of the most passionate humans I have ever met when it comes to the fitness space, but he has integrity, which I think for people in our field sometimes is difficult to come by. And he's the jack of all trades. He's literally an elite level bodybuilder. He is a physique coach, so he has practical experience. He is a researcher, and he is a professor, and he has a social media presence that is genuine. So I think you don't really find those 5 things in the field, and it's all because he's just that interested and cares that much about helping people. So I definitely recommend checking out his page if you're not already following him. If you will be by the time you listen to this. And I also want to introduce Christopher Irvin, who I met when I was a junior or senior, and similar story. He just kind of came into lab, and I could tell right away that he was there not to mess around, and he got to work. And it was kind of cool to see his transition, because when he initially came in, he was more interested in the sport performance space, but then once he got introduced to the ketogenic diet and its potential therapeutic aspects of it, I saw the light bulb just switch in his head, and I never seen someone work so hard so fast. He was working in 2 high-level laboratories at the same time. He was at Tampa, and then he also went over to USF down the road, where he was working with some elite researchers in the ketogenic space doing animal models. And then I also had the pleasure of living with him for a year or two, and at the time I thought I prided myself on working a lot, but this man was up at 4 o'clock in the morning and working till midnight, and he still does that. I don't get how he can pull that off now, especially with a kid. But he's a hard worker, and he's very involved in different aspects of the sort of low carb and wellness space. He touches on it a bit, but he's now sort of in the health tech side. And before that, he was with Perfect Keto, directly formulating products, as well as helping spread high quality information through his podcast, where he is the Ketologist, and now he's working for BioCoach, which is a really cool piece of technology that helps people track and get on top of their glucose, especially in the acute form after eating foods. And they not only measure it, but they provide you with detailed ways to improve your lifestyle habits. So without further ado, please enjoy this podcast with Christopher Barakat and Christopher Irvin. Should we do it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Welcome, world, to the inaugural episode of the Physiology and Philosophy podcast. I am your host, Jacob Roush, and today I am joined by my two favorite Chris's in the whole wide world. We have Christopher Irvin and Christopher Barakat. I will let them introduce themselves shortly, but I will say, just as a precursor, I've had the luxury of spending a lot of time with these two Chris's during my time at the University of Tampa, and I consider them to be some of the most informed practitioners when it comes to all things related to nutrition and making nutrition practical. And fortunately for the viewership, they both have different disciplines in which they practice. They'll get into it. Chris is in the low-carb keto space, and then Christopher Barakat deals with preparing individuals for bodybuilding competitions and has some research publications in the area. So without further ado, I introduce to you Chris Squared, and I will leave it up for you guys to introduce yourselves really quick.
Take it away. That's a big intro. Hopefully we can live up to the hype of being the two most informed people in the nutrition space. So I'm Chris Irvin. I have my master's in exercise and nutrition science from University of Tampa, which really awesome to be back here recording too. It's been a long time since been here. So I've spent the last 6 or 7 years studying low carb dieting, primarily in the disease management space. Over the last couple of years, I've kind of turned a lot of my focus towards diabetes specifically. I work for a company called BioCoach, which is a diabetes management company that has hardware and software focusing on making low carb dieting and health and wellness more accessible to the general population.
Cool. Yeah, so my primary focus has been enhancing body composition, maximizing performance and recovery variables for the most part. So I primarily work with physique athletes, but I also coach Gen Pop people as well. And I've been doing that for the last 8-ish years now. Time absolutely flies by, but I look forward to diving into this podcast. It's awesome to have Roush here in town from Cali. It's been too long, and I wish we could do it more frequently.
I love the Gen Pop thing, and like coming from the science world, Gen Pop is a term that we all recognize pretty formally.
Yeah.
As I've transitioned into industry and continued using that term, people think I'm referring to prison. So you're like, what do you mean Gen Pop? Like,
which inmate are you talking about?
Yeah. They think the prison is Gen Pop. Okay. Well, hopefully the nutritional advice that we provide you guys with today can be applied to those in prison and those outside of the prison world, because everyone deserves to be armed with the tools to live a healthy lifestyle, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. I figured we'll just dive into it off the jump. Again, we have two nutrition experts, so I want to start with a case study. In this scenario, I am a friend of a friend. I'm 28 years old. I played sports in high school, and I drank a lot of beer, and I lifted recreationally throughout college. However, I'm realizing that I am gaining weight at a rapid pace. My health is starting to go downhill, but I don't have the tools, and I don't know where to start. I want to be healthier. I want to put on more mass. I want to lose some fat mass, but I don't know which way is up. And in this instance, say they've reached out to me, or they know enough to do the resistance training component of getting healthy, but they know nothing on the nutritional aspect of how to get healthy. So just, take as long as you need to sort of get it, but where would you start with someone like this, Mr. Barakat?
Cool, it's a good case study that you present. What I would suggest right off the bat is I would ask that individual, when they were an athlete a few years back before their health started to take a negative spiral, ask themselves what their nutritional structure looked like then compared to what it looks like now, even though they didn't understand what they were doing or why they were doing what they were doing back then. Just compare those differences, and if they start structuring things in a more similar manner to what it used to be, it would probably be favorable for them.
Mm-hmm.
So at least taking apples and oranges and comparing what did I used to do, what am I currently doing, and what are some things that I'm currently doing that I need to make behavioral changes on. From a more technical standpoint, you know, I would ask them, okay, do you have any idea how many calories are you eating? If not, it's like, all right, let's potentially track for an entire week what you're currently doing. You don't have to make any changes. I just want to get an idea of what your nutritional intake currently looks like, and then from there I can start making suggestions on how we should go about structuring your day.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's a really practical question because I feel like that's something that many of us go through, like what your body's able to tolerate when you're younger changes as you get older. And I played college sports as well. I have a lot of buddies that were teammates who went through that, where it's like when you're an athlete and you're, you know, resistance training, you have practice, you're doing plyos and stuff like that, your calorie burn is so high that you can get away with having pizza on the weekends and drinking beer and stuff and, you know, attain a pretty good physique still.
For sure.
But as we get older, that obviously changes. So yeah, I think very similar to what you said. I think like getting an understanding of like where somebody's at currently with their nutrition. I know we kind of teed me up as the low carb guy in the room, but I'm more of I think generally speaking, there's kind of foundations of a solid diet that people need to stick to. And we were talking about this earlier, but I think there's like important health markers for you to kind of be shooting for, to be trying to improve. And there's many ways to get there. So I think getting an understanding, like you said, of where somebody's at currently can help us figure out where's the low-hanging fruit. Like, I think one of the big mistakes a lot of people make is, and you know, we're in January right now, so we're fresh out of the New Year's, where people come, they want to completely overhaul everything from the start. You know, I'm gonna do 75 hard. You know, I'm gonna do keto dieting, intermittent fasting. I'm hitting it all, and it's not very sustainable. So I think a lot of times you can look at somebody's diet and say, you know, I know on my side, working more with general population, it's like, well, if you're drinking soda or you're drinking a lot of beer, you're eating, you know, bread all of the time, those are some things we can cut out, and that might make 80% of the change for you, right? And I kind of take a little slightly different approach of, and we're going to get into this a lot. I think calories are one of the most important components of diet. Whether or not you choose to focus on them or you focus on something that gets you to focus, like inadvertently to focus on them, I think works. So I think understanding if you're somebody who you've been tracking calories for a while, you've been doing macros, then that makes sense to continue doing that. If you're somebody you have never done that before, I probably wouldn't start there. I'd probably look for some of those, like, how do we get you to where we want you to be with calories by focusing on something like cutting out, you know, soda, cutting out beer, cutting out these empty calories that don't provide much nutrition. And then from there, allowing them to start seeing the change. Because one of the things I think is really important is, you know, a lot of times if we're, depending on how, you know, sick we are, and using sick as a term of just not feeling well, not operating well in our day-to-day, is that you have to create some space to allow you to kind of take the next step, right? Like you have to free up, you know, if you're constantly feeling depressed, tired, getting out of bed in the morning to go to the gym sucks, you know, eating a salad sucks. Like it's very hard you can only use motivation to maintain something like that for so long. So you have to create some space where you start seeing the light. You start, oh, I have more energy now. You know, my mood is lifted a little bit. I'm a little bit more motivated to continue taking steps to improve. So I think generally it's like figuring out what the low-hanging fruit is in somebody's nutrition, and then, you know, attacking those, developing good, you said behavior change, I think that's huge, developing habits around that, and then from there figuring out where else you need to go to take it the rest of the way.
I hope we can definitely dive into like the foundations of like what your core nutrition principles are. And I also think it's interesting, your first step that you said was like, what are things we can take out? And I asked a sports nutritionist for the Yankees now a couple of years ago where she starts with her athletes, and her perspective was different. She said before she takes anything out, she tries to add in healthy habits. So if someone's not eating vegetables, then just try to add in more good stuff, and over time you can start to take away bad stuff. I can see a world in which both instances can work. And to what you said initially, Chris, in that instance that you provided, it was like the athlete had a certain eating style and then changed, which is what resulted in their health failing them. But I've also seen people who didn't even have, in the example it was an athlete, but like I have friends who never had good healthy habits to begin with, but their body just wasn't fighting them because of their youth or whatever. But I feel like they're almost more stuck because they don't have a healthy baseline from a habit standpoint. So from the starting standpoint, I think the nutrition space is one of the most heavily debated topics, but I think what most people will agree with is that to lose weight, you have to be burning more calories than you're taking in. And I know both of you have experience with coaching, so from a client standpoint, so now if the first question was like general advice, now if you have a one-on-one client, where do you guys start? Do you start by saying, here is a formula, here's your resting metabolic rate, your basal metabolic rate, and do you account for their physical activity, and then do you try to give them a calorie target, or do you start with, do you have them track? Do you try and just see what they're doing as step one?
Sure. So yeah, my step one, it can vary from person to person depending on where they're coming from and their current level of understanding. So if I have a physique client that has plenty of experience, I could just jump into the weeds of it and get deep in there right away. If I'm dealing with someone with no experience, I need to start all the way from just basic foundational principles and setting up with some general guidelines. So I'll kind of just give you my general guidelines first, and then I'll talk about how I formulate calories and stuff like that. Really basic things I want basically everybody to focus on, even if they have no experience. Try to have some sort of protein source with every single meal. You want to get, for most people, a minimum of 20 and up to 35 plus grams of protein per sitting. You want to make sure you're consuming at least 3 servings of vegetables every single day. That could be in one meal, so it can be like a vegetable omelet first thing in the morning, and you have a bunch of veggies in there, and maybe you don't love veggies and you don't eat them the rest of the day. Or it could be for dinner, you have a salad plus a veggie and a potato, whatever it may be. So you could spread it out, you could have it in one meal, whatever it may be, but try to get in at least 3 servings of veggies per day. And then for most of my people, I also have 2 servings of fruit per day if they're generally active and they have some sort of training regimen going on. So those are like the super basics. But when somebody comes to me and they do have a weight loss goal, they do want to improve their body composition, I do calculate, all right, how many calories per day do I suspect they need to maintain, gain, or lose weight? We start there. They start tracking what they're intaking. Their precision's not going to be great in the beginning anyway, so even though I'm giving them a caloric goal and macronutrient goals, I'm not expecting them to nail it, and that's totally fine. At least we have a ballpark of where they're at. And then based on how they're progressing or not progressing, we make adjustments down the road. But yeah, I mean, all of my clients eventually get, hey, this is your caloric goal, these are your macronutrient goals within ranges, and it's different for everyone. Some of my clients eat the same amount of calories per day and have very similar macro targets for every day. Some people have training day and non-training day. Some people like to do a Monday through Thursday thing, and then Friday, so they might do like low calorie days Monday through Thursday, higher calorie days Friday through Sunday, just for lifestyle, sustainability stuff. So all of those details vary from person to person, their preferences, their lifestyle, but the basics, protein in each meal, veggies, fruit, we'll figure the rest out after that.
Very cool. Yeah. So it's kind of from step one is a hybrid approach, essentially. So it's if they are capable of tracking, have them track, but you also have like some awareness of what your expectations are.
For sure. And last thing I'll say before I pass it off to Chris, I think it's important for someone to track for 3 to 6 months of their life so they get a better idea of what portion sizes actually look like. Yeah. That tool is something that they can utilize forever. So I don't track my food ever anymore unless I'm in a contest prep, but I know exactly what I'm putting in just because I've had the experience of using the food scale and tracking food. So I think it's just a tool that if you don't get carried away with it, it'll actually serve you much better for the long haul than it would be a negative experience.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Like, I'm grateful for, I had, one period in my life where I did a physique show where I was really paying attention to weighing out my food, tracking my calories, and it gave me a skill set now that like I look at food and I just see protein, calories, fat, carbs, like I just know what's in front of me, and it makes it more intuitive. You don't have to be, because like, to be honest, you're not going to want to track calories for the rest of your life. You're not going to want to be on your app inputting everything forever, right? Like you reach a point where unless you're trying to be in that top percent of like getting down to very low body fat, it's like generally in your life you're not going to want to do it forever. 100%. But you don't have to. That's like the good news with it.
Yeah.
I think for my approach is I think similar of like, I think giving a foundation of quality protein, here's foods that we want to, get in our diets. I think that's really important. And I like the point you made too about one of the, I think, biggest mistakes that we make with nutrition and dieting is that we focus on what we're removing from the diet, but not what we're replacing it with. So it's like, yeah, we want to cut out certain things, but we don't want to, lead to, a lot of times people, and we see this a lot in the low carb keto space where people are nutrient deficient because they're just not consuming quality nutrients. Like, yeah, you're low carb, but like your protein intake's low, your micronutrient status sucks. Like you're not really checking the boxes there. So it is important to focus on laying those foundations of quality protein, getting vegetables, all of those things. I think one of the differences that may be a little between you and I is that most of the population I work with in diabetes, there's not as much of a they're not as motivated to like achieve a physique goal. A lot of times it's like, I just want to lose 20 pounds, look a little better, or one of the big ones is like, I want my health insurance premium to go down, so I'm trying to get like my A1C better or something. So they don't have like that same level of motivation. But what I'll do when I initially talk to somebody is figure out where they're at on that. If you're somebody if you're highly motivated and you have some technical skill and you understand that, like that approach is the most optimal. You're going to get there quicker. You're going to get there. You're going to get where you want to go. There's not going to be as much guessing. That's a scientific approach. So that's the best way to go if somebody is in a position to be able to do it. If I get somebody who it's like, yeah, I've never done that before, or I tried doing it and I hated it, or you talk to somebody, like even when you're figuring out nutrition principles, somebody's like, yeah, I'm Italian, I love eating pasta, and it's like, I'm not going to put you on a keto diet then, because like you're not going to love that. You're going to be, just fighting tooth and nail to get through that.
For sure.
So I think that's kind of like a big thing for me is figuring out, we talked about it with a dude today. It's like the best diet is a diet that you can stick to, right? So it's not about, subscribing to this diet or that diet. It's like, what's going to be the thing that allows you to hit your goal? And if I see that you're somebody who like it's going to be very easy for you to adopt a lower carb diet, then we'll go that route. If it's not, then I would look at something more like focusing on calories or carb cycling or other approaches like that. So that's a big missing component. I think we were talking about today too in social media. When you hear nutrition influencers talk, it's like if anybody says that one diet's the best way, then they're full of shit. That's what we know, right? It's because personalized nutrition, and more people are talking about that now, but personalized nutrition is the most important thing. And not even just from a standpoint of like, oh, our bodies are different, what works for you is different for me. It's like what fits into your lifestyle. Like I think, BJ Fogg is somebody who he's a doctor who has this book, Tiny Habits. I don't know if you guys have read that book. But it talks a lot about how, a lot of times early on people, motivation is a great driver of achieving hard things, but motivation's fleeting. For many people, unless you're somebody that's just very driven and you have this goal that you just, you never back down from, that motivation disappears. So to give somebody something that's crazy hard, like in that New Year's example where you're doing 75 hard and eating keto and intermittent fasting, you might be able to do that for 30 days, but come February, you're back where you were in December eating the same diet that you were. So my approach when I'm talking to people is figuring out how do we put you in a position where you're going to be able to do this diet and this nutrition protocol within your existing life. Like, yeah, we do need to change some things, right? Like we need to develop better habits. If you go out to the bar 3 nights a week drinking, like that's probably not going to be optimal. We need to like, change a few things, but like if it's coming down to, I want you to eat X number of meals a day and you have this busy lifestyle that doesn't account for that, that's not going to work. So most of my conversations with people, and that's even from, from athletes that I've worked with, I've worked with some professional football players all the way down to general population, is like, what is your, like, how driven are you to do this? Where are you at on the scale of like motivation? Like if you're highly motivated in the beginning and we can hit you with something a little bit more challenging to make progress to a certain point and then ease into something better, like we'll do that approach. But if you're not there yet, then it's like we need to find a way to meet you where you're at currently.
For sure. I think a lot of people around the New Year's time, why fad diets are so appealing is because it's something that they think they can follow, but over time they're either restrictive or it's just difficult for them to stick to. And that's the main reason why I wanted to start this channel, was to, like you said, like you want to give people the tools to live a healthy lifestyle that's practical, that they could adhere to long term. Like I don't even like the term diet. It's just more like your nutritional habits. but I don't think people are armed with the foundations. And you were talking about like the understanding of what's in your food. And I know no one asked me for my take, but I think it's difficult because on one hand, tracking your macros, even with an app, is tedious and it's annoying, but I think it's valuable and it teaches you a lot. And I had a friend who, shout out Mike Solomonic, in college wanted to put on weight, and he actually, I gave him macros and he learned how to track his food. And I remember he was like, whoa, he's like, dude, you know peanut butter has like a lot of calories? And I'm like, yeah, and that stuck with him to this day. And now he has the same tools that we do, where like I'll be in bed at night and I'll run through the meals I ate and I'll have a pretty accurate representation of how many calories I had, how many carbs I had, what my fat was at. And you can get to the point where you can do that without tracking, but if it's going to impair your ability to start, then start with something general like adding healthy things or taking negative things away. But if you're listening to this, I would strongly recommend you eventually give tracking a chance. You don't have to do it forever, but I think that was step one for me, is know what's in your food. Know what foods are calorically dense, what foods are calorically light. Personally, I'm someone who likes voluminous foods, so through tracking, I've found my snacks that I can eat a lot of that are low calorie, so I don't feel bad. Where some people may, cut out fast food and switch to quote unquote healthier alternatives, but they're not aware that they may be eating more calories because even though the sort of the story around the food is healthier. So if step one is learning to track your calories, I'd like to dive deeper into what both of your like nutritional foundations are. Chris, I think both of you share a similar baseline of protein's where you start, and that's, I think, increasing in popularity. But I think we grew up in the age where for some reason protein was demonized. But what are your like core nutrition principles that you try to add outside of calories?
Sure, I'll dive into that in 1 second. I found it interesting that you mentioned a lot of people don't have a good foundational understanding of what is a carb-based food, what is a protein-based food, what's a fat-based food. You mentioned the peanut butter.
Yeah.
So yesterday was the first lecture of the semester, and it's a nutritional supplements class, but the first 3 classes are just all nutrition stuff.
Yeah.
And like sometimes I feel rude like showing this to like a college student, because I would hope that they know like what are carb sources, what are proteins, what are the combinations of that. But like they have never seen anything like that in high school or middle school or whatever, so they might not know something that basic, right? So if you don't understand where your nutrients are coming from and what food sources are providing you with what nutrients, like you mentioned peanut butter, a lot of people think peanut butter is a good source of protein or whatever. Like, no, it's a fat source that has minimal trace protein, and those amino acids are terrible anyway. Like, doesn't have your all 9 essential aminos. So like it is really important to start with the basics, and if you don't understand something like this, telling someone to like nail their macros to the T is the longest shot in the park. Like, it's not going to happen. They don't even know how to fill in those macronutrients. So something like that's really important. Maybe you pop it up on the screen or something.
That's actually, just to go on, I think it is something that being that we know nutrition pretty well, I think a lot of times we forget that people don't know some of those things. I know, like through working at BioCoach, and we talk to a lot of people with diabetes, for instance, so we're very focused on carbohydrates by way of that population, and we see all the time where people will be like, well, does bread have carbohydrates? Like, people ask these questions, they'll be like, does butter have carbs? Like, they totally don't know. And it's always a good refresher for me to be like, like, that's not a baseline information that people are equipped with. Like, if you don't go seek that, where else are you going to get that? Like, you're not going to get that in school, unless you're taking nutrition courses. Like, you do have to arm them with that knowledge, because how are you going to fill in macros if you don't know what's a good source of protein? Like, we look at foods, and I know, if I look at peanut butter, I'm thinking that's fat. If I'm looking at meat, I'm thinking mostly that's protein, but also some fat. If I'm looking at sweet potato, that's carbs. Like, other people, it's like, I don't know, no idea. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, for sure. I can dive into that question now. So some of the foundational
nutritional principles from Christopher Barakat, CISSN, MS, CSCS, ATC.
Okay. So first I generally start with a caloric target, and then, I mean, if we're talking about macronutrients now, I start off with setting their protein goal first, I set their fat goal second, and then their carbohydrates are last. Again, some people forget too that proteins and fats are your essential macronutrients, carbohydrates technically aren't. So even though the majority of the population uses glucose as their primary energy source, you probably should nail your protein and fat needs first, and then your carbs should be based on your activity levels, your performance, your recovery demands, and everything like that. So that's just how I generally set up stuff. In regards to, I kind of covered things before about the fruits, the vegetables, the protein in every single meal. Those are like my overarching principles. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's just gonna start with calories, macronutrients, micronutrients, and then depending on their lifestyle, nailing their meal frequency and nutrient timing, it's gonna depend on the person, their preferences, their needs.
Mm-hmm. Chris, before you go, I feel like maybe we should just zoom out really quick for a second. Yeah. And we introduced the conversation by, burning more calories than you're consuming for a method of weight loss, but just the definition of what a calorie is. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. A calorie is a form of energy, or it's the amount of energy required to produce a bodily action measured in joules.
Yes, I mean, technically it's about creating a certain amount of heat.
Okay.
So inside a vacuum, how much energy is required to create X amount of heat? Same thing within our body, right? So how much energy do we get from a specific nutrient?
And you mentioned macronutrients and micronutrients, and there are three main macronutrients. You have your carbohydrates, your proteins, your fats. You showed us a figure that hopefully in post-production we can get up on the screen of the main types of foods that fill in those macronutrient categories. And just from a calorie perspective, each gram of carbohydrates is going to yield 4 calories. Similar for protein, 4 calories per gram. And then fats, the reason why they can be sneaky if you're not careful is they yield 9 calories per gram. And then outside of just macronutrient intake, you have your micronutrients, which are your vitamins and minerals that are essential for certain bodily functions. But within the calories, this form of energy that we want to optimize to alter our body composition needs, I just felt that would, if you're literally starting from baseline, that can be helpful to know. And now we'll pass it off to Chris to give us Chris Irvin's MS, CSCS, CISSN.
I don't have all those.
Nutritional habits.
Well, one thing, and this goes back a little bit to the last question, I'll add it as a caveat, that sometimes the initial approach that I take will be dependent on the route we're going to go with diet. So what I've kind of noticed before is if I'm going keto with somebody or low carb, I'll focus less on calories by way of, and I'll kind of take an approach of like, here's an approved food list, and then use that to allow them to see progress to a point where they don't see it anymore, and then start tracking calories. And the only reason why that works is because one of the things that happens with keto is you're cutting out a macronutrient, so you're inducing a calorie deficit naturally. I think if you're not doing keto, the calories become more important because you have to be more selective about inducing that calorie deficit, whereas it'll kind of have, because now this has changed over the last few years. It tends to be a little bit harder to eat in a calorie surplus, even though fat is higher in calories. When you're sticking to primarily protein and fat by way of whole food protein and fat, it's a little bit harder to overeat those things. Like if you're eating meat, it's gonna be hard to just really overdo it on meat, unless you're going to like Texas de Brazil or like Fogo de Chao or one of those places. Like it's a little bit more challenging. Now that has changed a little bit in the last few years as more keto low carb snacks have hit the market that are like hyperjacking. They're hyper palatable. Like you could definitely overeat those foods now, even though they're low carb, because they're using sweeteners and stuff that like can just stimulate more hunger. So that has changed a little bit, but generally if you're eating a lower carb whole food diet, it becomes easier to naturally get into that calorie deficit. So what I'll do with a lot of people is let them get to a point where, like if you start, here's your list, eat foods off this list, don't worry about anything. If you're seeing progress, cool. And then once you get to the part where you're not, then it's, let's start track for a few days, where are you at, and we'll make some adjustments. But I do think it changes. If you're not doing keto, we have to focus on that up front, because if you're just eating all of the foods, you're going to have a harder time getting into that calorie deficit. So I'll make that as like a caveat to it. But my foundations are, it's mostly protein based, and it's meat. Like for me, I think that everybody needs to be consuming meat, and I think red meat in particular. I think like red meat and eggs are something that everybody should be consuming. That's, I know, a little bit fear. There's a lot of fear around that today. People worried about saturated fat and cholesterol. What we know about those things is that they're actually essential to our health. We have to have those things, and I think that the fear of those things is it's harming us as a population, because not only are those foods, they tend to be more satiating, but they're incredibly nutrient dense. And you talked about protein and peanut butter not being adequate protein. Meat is. It's it's your essential. All of your essential amino acids are in there. It's a complete protein source. But also the nutrients that are found in those sources are more bioavailable to us. So, and I think that's an important part of the conversation, because a lot of times we'll look at different plant sources and be like, oh, these plant sources have X, Y, and Z vitamin and mineral. But when you look at studies of certain, like vitamin A, for instance, it's like what your body can absorb of vitamin A from a plant-based source is a lot lower. So maybe this food has a really high amount of vitamin A, but if you're only able to absorb 10% of it, it doesn't matter. Whereas meat, maybe it'll contain less. Liver is an exception, it has a lot, but meat maybe it contains a little bit less of vitamin A, but if you can absorb 90 to 95% of it, then that's a better source of those nutrients. So to me, that's my biggest focus is like, I want you eating meat, I want you eating protein, because if you're doing that, I think you're one, it's going to allow you to be able to exercise, which I think is an important thing. Like, you're going to recover better, you're going to have energy to exercise. You're going to be getting the micronutrients, which is important. Macronutrients, I think, are what move the needle on body composition, recovery, making adaptations in the gym and stuff. Micronutrients, I think, are what's going to make you feel good, brain perform well, body function well. So we want to place a good focus on that. So for me, that's the baseline. And then from there, what I kind of use as a foundation, insulin sensitivity is like an important thing for me. I think it's looking at that. If you're somebody who is very insulin sensitive, you're training a lot, like you mentioned, you're an athlete, you use carbohydrates well. So for me to take those away from you doesn't make any sense. We're not going to take those away. If you're very insulin resistant, which we could measure by fasting insulin test, A1C, fasting glucose, or in our space, the oral glucose tolerance test. If you're very insulin resistant, then I'm going to be a little bit more focused on carbohydrates, because even though there's many, and we can get into this later too, I think there's many levers that you can pull on to improve insulin sensitivity. For the general population, 30 to 60 days, I think, of focusing on low carb is a pretty easy, it's an easier way for most people to be able to achieve that. Because I think to think that you're not going to eat carbohydrates forever is silly. People aren't going to do that. So, but what we want to do is we want to get you to a point where you can eat them and use them. And that's really for everybody. Like working with some professional football players, for instance, it's like if I'm dealing with a wide receiver who is incredibly lean, very insulin sensitive, like let's eat carbohydrates because they're a great, and we can get into the sports science of it, but great ergogenic aid. They can provide a ton of performance benefits. So we want the ideal athlete should be able to consume carbs and put them to good use. But if you're insulin resistant, you're not going to put those carbs to good use. So if I have, say, an offensive lineman who's incredibly insulin resistant, I want to get you insulin sensitive so that you can use those carbohydrates. It's not that I don't want you to ever consume carbs. I want those to be productive carbs for you. So once I get past I want you to be eating meat, I want you to be focusing on protein, which is a big barrier to a lot of people because we're so afraid of that. The next thing I'm looking at is where are you at on this insulin sensitivity scale, and which lever can we pull to improve that, to get you to a point where, like, I think one of the ancestral living's gotten really big, right, over the last few years. And I think eating more like our ancestors is great, but like our ancestors also never had like a pizza place next door that has the best pizza in town. And like I think as humans, we should be able to enjoy the amazing things that humans have created when it comes to like cuisine and food and everything. So it's like, I want to be able to tee you up so that you can do those things and still be successful with improving your health. So that's kind of the area where I'll focus on a lot, because I think you can make a lot of progress in a short period of time, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and getting yourself to a point where now you can enjoy those foods. You can go out for ice cream with your kids. You can have pizza, on the weekends and stuff, and not set yourself back or have to feel like shit after doing those things.
I love it. So you start with an emphasis on protein, and then your carbohydrate recommendations are going to reflect their insulin sensitivity as an individual. sustainable.
And to a degree too, because like I mentioned in the beginning, you know, just because if you're like, say you're insulin resistant to the point of pre-diabetes, if still going keto is something that's not going to be sustainable for you, like we're not going straight there. So maybe what we do, that's when I'm probably looking at your diet and saying, where's the obvious like carbs we should cut out? Like if you're going to the gas station getting a big gulp soda every day, like let's get rid of that. That's going to make a big difference. You know, let's get rid of, you know, when you go out to dinner, like let's get rid of the bread and let's look at like some whole food carbs. Let's eat some fruit. You know, maybe we can sub the ice cream at night for some Greek yogurt and blueberries or something like that, or some fruit. And using that to create space so that we can see, for some people that would be enough. Like we can get your numbers where they need to be, and you don't have to go any further. Or for some people it's like, yeah, we actually need to maybe pull it back a little bit more, or go a completely different route and focus on one of those other levers that I mentioned. But yeah, so a lot of it's like reading and reacting. That's why you can't take this one size fits all, because it's like, you know the optimal macronutrient rate. You can look at somebody and look at their numbers and be like, this is what you need to do to be healthy, but that doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like those people have to be able to do it, right? So there has to be a little bit of taking into consideration their lifestyle.
I love it. I want to touch back on the dirty keto that you were talking about, but before then, in just, prioritizing protein, is the current RDA still 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, or I've seen like 1.8 to 2.0 as being optimal for muscle hypertrophy, but for the general population, are either of you aware of like currently what the RDA is?
I thought the RDA was 0.8.
Yeah, I would say the last I knew it was 0.8. It's very low. Yeah.
Super low.
So so zero. So that's saying the nutritional guidelines recommend that you should have 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, and from the maximizing muscle growth standpoint, I believe they recommend nearly twice that.
Okay.
So from 1.
Even more than that. Yeah.
It's 1.6 to 2.0.
Yeah.
So on the topic of, like we said in the beginning, people were scared about protein, and people were especially scared about red meat. So I'll play the skeptic, and I am a listener of this advice, and I'm saying, you imbeciles, protein is going to destroy my liver, and saturated fat is going to clog my arteries. You guys are idiots. How do you respectfully, where did that come from? Or even if you don't want to touch on how we got here, what does the evidence say? Are high protein diets harmful to any aspect or for any population? And what does elevated saturated fats in your diet do? And are there certain populations that should worry about protein and saturated fat, or is the current guidelines just completely off?
Yeah, I'll let you start it off.
Yeah, so I think the first one, protein, is I think the silliest one, because there's no good evidence. I know most of it's centered around like kidney health, and there's a few studies that maybe point to seeing some elevated like kidney inflammatory markers from consuming protein. But if you look at the body of evidence as a whole, even people with like the most kidney damage, seeing damage from protein is non-existent. So that one's really silly to me, because the saturated fat one makes more sense because there's at least a body of work around that you could look at. You could look at the research and you could say, especially if you're not diving into the methods, you could say that's there. I don't even see it on the protein side, so that one doesn't make sense for me at all. So I think we can just push that one to the side. Now the saturated fat one, that's based on really 40-50 years of research it's research being used in a way that it's not supposed to be used. So and it's a challenging thing. It's not like that I have a good answer for improving the research component of it, but a lot of the research that's used to say the saturated fat and cholesterol are bad for us is epidemiological research, it's not something we can use to say is causative. We can use it to figure out correlations with things, but we can't say that this is the cause based on that. How that research should be used is you would take that and then you would develop a study around that would allow you to better isolate what the cause of a problem is. And those studies do exist, and we look at those studies, we don't see saturated fat having this impact on our health that people say it does. Now, you did mention the component of, are there some people that shouldn't have that? And there are some genetic predispositions where having a lot of cholesterol and saturated fat could potentially be harmful. But even those studies are a little bit tough to interpret, because though that's saturated fat consumed within the scope of the standard American diet, where you're also consuming a lot of added sugar, a lot of processed foods, a lot of pro-inflammatory things that kind of creates that problem. So I think the big thing that we have to understand with saturated fat and cholesterol is that both of those things are essential for human health. We have to have those things. Our brain needs cholesterol. Our hormone production is dependent on these things. And when we look at the fear of clogging your arteries, right? That's like the big thing that everybody's afraid of. What people aren't looking at is the mechanism for how that occurs. And the way that occurs is that LDL cholesterol, which isn't the same as the cholesterol that you consume in food. That's a big, and I think it's a naming convention that makes it confusing for people. People say cholesterol, and cholesterol means, it encompasses everything when you're looking at, but there's cholesterol in food, and then there's our HDL and LDL cholesterol in our bodies, and those are completely different things. So when you're getting your blood cholesterol measured, the cholesterol that you consume in your diet actually gets out of circulation in a very short period of time. So if you're taking a fasted blood test, that's not reflecting the cholesterol that you've consumed in your diet. That's reflecting your HDL and LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is typically deemed as the bad cholesterol, and that has made everybody think that, oh, it's bad, there's nothing good to it. But LDL cholesterol has a purpose. It does something in our bodies. And the reason why we have this association with it being bad is that if we look at epidemiological research, if we look at groups of people who have high rates of cardiovascular disease, we do see that LDL tends to be elevated. So we say, okay, that it's elevated, it must be the cause. One of my favorite analogies for this is, if you look at why LDL is elevated, it would be like you coming home, your house is on fire, the firemen are there, and blaming the firemen for putting your house on fire, right? LDL cholesterol is going to be present if you have cardiovascular disease because it's trying to repair. So if you have damage to your arteries, LDL cholesterol is going to be bringing nutrients to try to repair that. Now, what can happen is if you have high levels of inflammation, the protective layer in your arteries can become damaged, and there's more opportunity for LDL cholesterol to infiltrate your blood vessels to cause that plaque buildup that you're talking about. So that's a potential issue. So the question should be, well, why is inflammation present? So that would be something we would want to worry about. The other thing is that within LDL, the scope of LDL, there is particle size. So there's bigger particles or smaller particles. The smaller particles are more able to infiltrate and are more able to get clogged and cause a problem. So we have to look at, well, what causes a shift in particle size? Well, it's inflammation and insulin resistance that causes that. So if we look at cholesterol and saturated fat consumed within the standard American diet, there can be some dangers there. But when we remove the rest of these foods and we look at treating things like insulin resistance and inflammation, we see that cholesterol and saturated fat are not only not causing disease at all, but they're actually incredibly important for things like long-term brain health, hormone production, and just our body being able to operate as a whole. I think the one thing that's important to address is everybody gets all up in arms about the research because people think that there's these Dr. Evils out there that have it out for human health, and that's not the case at all. We got to where we are today because in the 50s there was an increase in cardiovascular disease. Our president during that time had cardiovascular disease. There was a fear around it, and there was a ton of emphasis put on finding out why and something to focus on, because people don't want it to be vague. They don't want to know. They want to know, what do I need to do and not do? And early research was used in an inappropriate manner to kind of peg cholesterol and saturated fat as being the demon in that situation, and that was enough for people to say that's what we're going to lean into. And all of the body of research since then has been based around those studies. Just looking, I think and you always hear people kind of push back and they'll be like, well, where's the studies that show that it doesn't cause that? And we do have studies that show that, but maybe even more importantly, we have to look mechanistically at the body, and there's not even a mechanism for why consuming those foods would cause a problem. That's just not how it works. Yeah. The cholesterol that causes damage inside of our bodies is cholesterol that's produced by our liver. It's not, coming from the foods that we eat.
Yeah, there's a lot of confounding variables in those studies in regards to, if you're looking at certain populations of people, you're seeing the correlation between the two, but you're not considering everything else that they do. Mm-hmm. A lot of those people are eating in a caloric surplus, they're overweight, their activity level's low, they're consuming a certain amount of alcohol. So there's so many other lifestyle factors that are, again, leading to high levels of inflammation, insulin resistance, and then they have issues with cholesterol. I think another issue is just nomenclature in general. Like, some people demonize fat, and I feel like if the back of your nutrient label said lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins, people wouldn't fear fat the way that they fear fat, because they automatically assume it's going to lead to more body fat, more visceral fat, whatever it may be.
Yeah, good point.
So just the naming of things and the misunderstanding of cholesterol in your body versus cholesterol in your food is a little bit different. So all of that makes an impact. Going back to the protein stuff, yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions there as well. In terms of just a general recommendation, I like to have most people, I recommend 1 gram of protein per pound of lean mass. So if you have a 200-pound male that's 20% body fat, they have 40 pounds of fat mass, 160 pounds of fat-free mass, I would recommend maybe 160 grams of protein. I think the recommendations where it's just this much macronutrient per kilogram of total body weight is not very practically applicable if you have somebody that's very, very lean and underweight, or in today's society, most people are overweight and heavy, where you can give them too much fat or too much protein or whatever it may be. So I like using lean body mass as my tool to start actually giving more precise numbers.
I like it. That makes sense. I mean, I think one of the next topics I want to talk about with you guys is, individualized nutrition and what's the future of nutrition. But I definitely like the perspective of taking it one step further from not just 1 gram per kilogram of mass, but 1 gram per pound of actual lean mass. On the notion of fat, one of the internal stories that I've switched on myself is when I'm eating fats or cooking with fats, I think of it from the hormone development standpoint, where I'm like, oh, if I'm getting omega-3 fatty acids, or this fat I'm getting through butter is going to help me produce more testosterone and help me get my gain from there. And just to put a bow on the protein before we pivot is, I think some people really don't, you have to make an effort to have 20 grams of protein in each meal. And I love my fiance to death, but sometimes I look at a meal she'll construct and she's gotten a lot better. But when we first started dating, I was just like, that's not protein. Yeah,
consumed.
Chickpeas and rice and a salad is not a high quality protein source. So if you take anything away from this podcast, it's a high quality protein source at minimum in every meal, and the evidence will support your lean mass, your bone health, and if you pair that with high fats, ultimately your hormonal health as well. And going back to what Chris was saying on, call it clean keto or dirty keto, one of the reasons why I'm not skeptical or worried about the rise in popularity of a low carb or ketogenic diet is because it's twofold. One is my first exposure to keto was dirty keto, and I took your approach where I wasn't necessarily focusing on my total calories, I was just focusing on the ratio. And I wasn't doing it through whole foods, I was doing it through heavy whipping cream and bacon and eggs and all of the stuff that would satisfy my sweet tooth. But I, through evidence of a DEXA scan, in 3 weeks of this dirty keto, I lost 2 kilograms of lean mass and gained 2 kilograms of fat mass. So I think some people they're like, oh, I'm keto. I'm like, I hope you're informed. And I think that's a big issue. And I also think that some people just, if you're gonna do it, you have to do it right. So you live in this space more than me. I don't claim to have any ties to the keto industry now, but do you think that any harm has been done with the just rise in popularity of these low carb diets, and thinking that it's easier to implement than it may actually be?
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on that question a lot, because I've seen a lot happen over the years, and even just the topic of dirty and clean keto, it really depends, because I'm a proponent of clean keto. I think that whole food diet is the way to go, but also there's times where you see somebody who and I think it's a little bit different. You being somebody, your experience, you were leaner, in good shape, training really hard. For somebody who is 50 pounds overweight, super sedentary, sometimes dirty keto gets them some of the progress they need to start creating again that space that you need to then take it to the next level. So 3 years ago I would have said everybody needs to be doing clean keto, but now I see these stories of all right, people maybe start out doing dirty keto, they start seeing some progress, and then they start cleaning it up. So I think a lot of it really comes down to awareness. And you know, and I've seen, like, when I first started out in keto 2015, there was no education sites out there. There was not many, like, you know, influencers on social media talking about it. If you went into the store, there wasn't a single thing labeled keto. So you were either eating whole food or you were looking for recipes online where you could make, you know, fat bombs was like the big thing back then. So there was less of an issue then, and then, you know, around 2018, and I worked for I've had to think about this a lot because I worked for a company that made keto foods, you know, that are now they're on shelves in stores. I went to Sprouts the other day and they had some on the shelf there. So I had to think about this a lot, and it was like, you know, there's two things wrong. There's two potential things wrong with that approach. Is that, well, I guess to maybe even take a step back, the benefit of doing a whole food keto diet versus a dirty keto diet is that whole food keto diet, you are removing something and replacing it with nutrient dense food, so you're covering your bases there. Dirty keto, you might be removing something, as in you're removing processed carbohydrates, but you're not replacing it with you know, nutrient dense foods. So that's where you end up with people who are micronutrient deficient, protein deficient, they're not getting quality fats. That can be a potential issue. Again, maybe in the short term, not so bad if it starts giving you some progress, but definitely not an optimal approach long term. Now, the issue with the development of these low carb foods is that a lot of them are basing their kind of label of low carb keto off of net carbs, right? That's been the big thing that everybody pays attention to. But as we know from, you know, I've done a lot of blood sugar testing. One of the ones, I don't want to throw them under the bus, but I will, is like the Smart Sweets, the gummies. You know, those are marketed as like 4 grams of net carbs. They broke my CGM when I turned them on. My CGM shut off. I had to test with a blood sugar meter. It doubled my blood sugar when I took them. So 4 grams of net carbs, they spiked my blood sugar more than if I would have just ate gummies, just regular full sugar gummies.
Wow.
So you look at things like that, and it's like, that sucks for people, because especially from somebody who, let's say you're diabetic and you're trying to focus on your blood sugar levels, you're not, like, you're eating this food thing and you're not tracking, let's say, measuring your blood sugar levels. You're consuming this food assuming that the low net carb is getting you where you need to be, but it's not. When I was at Perfect Keto, you know, we formulated keto bars and other products that we had out there that we did extensive blood sugar testing, so they didn't spike your blood sugar. So that was great. People can eat these things. They're not going to see, they're not going to have these same problems. They'll be able to see progress on them. But the problem is that those foods, because they're sweet, it's not just sugar that can cause food addictions. Things that are generally sweet can cause food addictions. You know, monk fruit, which is a common sweetener used in keto-friendly foods, is like 300 times sweeter than sugar. Like, so if you were consuming that, and it's a super hyper-palatable food, you're going to want more of that. You know, it's a packaged food. And packaged foods, we want to eat more of them. They taste good. They're also very calorically dense. So that can be a potential problem. So for us, and something that it was my kind of mission when I was at Perfect Keto, was to let people know that this is not what your diet should look like. This is a tool that you use. So if at the beginning you have a crazy sweet tooth, like, yeah, why don't you grab this keto bar that we make that's pretty sweet tasting and consume that instead of consuming a candy bar. But the other 98% of your diet needs to be whole food. You need to be having, you know, meat and vegetables, you know, in the case of keto, lower glycemic fruits with your meals. That needs to be what makes up the bulk of your diet. You know, companies who are selling these foods are not incentivized to tell you those things, right? So they're just going to say, eat this and you're keto and you're good. Mm-hmm. So to kind of answer your question of, is the rise in popularity of keto a good or bad thing? It's really hard to say, because it's a good thing in that there's more awareness around it now. And you know, when I post something about keto on social media and I hear all these incredible success stories of, I got off of my blood pressure medication, I got off of, you know, my A1C lowered, so I'm off of diabetes medication, all these things, then you would think, wow, the rise in popularity has been great for keto, because there's people that are seeing benefits that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise seen. So I would say generally yes, but the rise in its popularity combined with capitalistic mindset has led to the development of these products that can actually move people further away from health than what they should be. So I think it really comes down to a level of awareness and understanding of, like, the diet needs to look a certain way, and these other things that are out there can be used as it can be used as things when you want to take, like, I would almost consider it like you should look at a keto-friendly treat the same way you would look at ice cream that you would eat anyway. Like, just because it's keto is not an excuse for you to be able to eat it eating ice cream every day generally not a good thing, and the same is true for the keto-friendly ice cream.
I mean, coming from someone who has experience on the inside of the industry, I think that's a really good point to emphasize, because I have friends and colleagues and family members who have tried keto, and instead of prioritizing high quality food sources and having a supplement of a keto snack, they see the keto snack as the bulk of their, what they can eat on this diet. And
it's keto. I can do that.
You heard it from the expert himself, and I think we can all agree at this table, no matter what diet you're on, I think most people will agree, prioritize, natural, nutrient-dense food sources that are rich in either protein or vitamins and minerals, and then you can individualize your carbohydrate intake or the specific foods that you use to ultimately fill this calorie intake to meet your needs for the day. But start with the basics and take it from there. And I kind of want to stay on the topic of fad diets, and then we can transition out here a little bit. It kind of, some slight personal experience where, if we just listed them all, there was Atkins, there was low carb, there's vegan, there's carnivore, there's paleo. Give me some more. Is that
zone diet?
Zone diet.
I was going to talk about if it fits your macros quick.
Yeah.
That kind of, when you were talking about clean keto versus dirty keto, I'm not really involved in the keto space at all, so I haven't even heard the terms and how it was explained.
Yeah.
But that's literally the same as like, do you track your macronutrients and calories, or are you a if it fits your macros kind of person? So like the IIFYM thing sounds really similar to what dirty keto is.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you have your Pop-Tarts instead of your sweet potato, and you have your cereals and your ice creams, and you're just hitting your numbers and everything is fine, bro. Like, you don't have to worry about it. Same thing with the dirty keto, like, oh, as long as you're hitting your ratios and you're getting fats and proteins, you don't need to worry about it. You're in dietary ketosis or whatever it may be, and that shouldn't be what diet is focused on. So a couple light bulbs went off when you guys were talking, and because I'm not in the keto space, it's interesting to hear your perspective, because I think keto can be used as a good tool to get someone kickstarted.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't see somebody sticking to it for the rest of their life.
Totally.
So I'm not a huge fan of it for that purpose. So like you mentioned
No,
because like you mentioned some of the success stories that you've heard with clients and people that send you messages. They're able to get off their blood pressure medication, they improve their A1C and their fasting blood glucose, and that's amazing. But it's not necessarily because of the ketogenic diet.
Mm-hmm.
It was most likely because they finally entered a caloric deficit. They probably lost some body fat.
Mm-hmm.
They improved their overall health while adhering to a ketogenic lifestyle. But the ketogenic diet didn't cause all those things. So if they stayed at caloric maintenance and they didn't lose body fat, their levels wouldn't have necessarily improved, right? So I don't know, I just want people to find sustainability. I don't like putting labels on how I diet. So like some people would say, like, oh, you're a flexible dieter just because I track macronutrients or because I have clients track macronutrients. I don't want a label on my thing. It's like, I adhere to these guidelines, these are my goals. I focus on nutrient dense foods, and depending on what our goals are at the time, how we're programming our nutrition, our exercise and everything, that's going to yield specific outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
But it's tough. Like, to me, I found it interesting to hear your perspective, where it was like the outcomes were, I don't want to say you said it was due to the ketogenic diet, but it helped a person get to a healthier body weight, body composition, and all their health markers improved. I just, because of the sustainability issue, it's hard for me to like be a huge fan of it. But yeah, it seems like there is a lot of similarities though, just in terms of dieting camps, the mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I wanted to mention was, you said a lot of people automatically enter a calorie deficit just by going on a ketogenic diet, which I can definitely see as probably being true because they're omitting carbohydrates at all. One thing I think is important to note, if you're not going ketogenic and you're just eating a very well balanced diet, most clients I work with, if I start them off at theoretical maintenance at first, if they're on a high protein diet and they're eating primarily whole foods, it's so hard for them to be in a surplus.
Yeah.
Like they have a hard time hitting their theoretical caloric maintenance while eating a high protein diet and while getting those 3 servings of vegetables, those 2 servings of fruit, because they're getting high fiber food, high volume food, micronutrient dense stuff that isn't negatively impacting their satiety cues and their hunger cues.
Totally.
Everything's under control. The higher protein intake really helps with satiety as well. So it's like instead of omitting carbohydrates as a whole, if you just really, really limited your processed food to a very large degree, you'll probably enter a calorie deficit or be eating at maintenance rather than being in this continued surplus that you have been in.
Yeah.
So those are just some thoughts that came to mind.
Yeah, and I actually totally agree with you on it, because I think, I do think that there are, not for the sake of the health markers I mentioned, I do think the one benefit that keto will provide is like there's certain benefits of being in ketosis that there can be benefit to it, right? So, but not, those are separate from those health markers. And I agree that, like, is what we talked about on our walk today, is that I think you should look at health as there's certain markers that you want to focus on, and there are many ways to get to those markers, right? And keto can be one of those ways, or like your approach can be one of those ways, or any of these other diets can be one of those ways. So I think that's how I wish the community as a whole would look at it, is that we need to focus on these things because they're important for overall health, and then you choose the route that helps you get there. So like one of the things that I'll hear from people is that, like you'll take two separate people and you put them on a keto diet. One person will say, I love this because I can't just have some carbs, because if I have any carbs, I want to have all the carbs, and then I overconsume calories and I miss the calorie deficit part of it. So keto works for me. Then you get this other person who says, man, I feel restricted. I can't stick to this. It's not sustainable. I want to binge eat. I can't do this, right? So for like those two people, it's like, okay, this makes sense for you. It's the same thing with like, intermittent fasting. Why, like, again, I think there's some slight additional benefits to it, but the big thing is intermittent fasting, you're cutting out a meal, you're going to achieve a calorie deficit. And I think it was Huberman actually who kind of made this analogy of like, for some people, it's easier to say, I'm not going to have that muffin at breakfast than it is to say I'm going to have half of that muffin at breakfast, right? So it's like, what camp do you fall into?
Sure.
And knowing yourself to say, okay, I can do this and go this route, or I can't and I can go there. So totally agree that it's not that it's keto is a tool that can, if done right, initiate a reaction that will get you to that goal. But the part that you mentioned about sustainability, I do think is incredibly important, because there is this like all or nothing approach where people think that like, oh, if I do it, I have to do it forever, and then not doing it means going in the opposite direction. I don't think that's the case at all. I think for me, the level of success with it, if we agree that metabolic health and insulin is insulin resistance, and that is kind of an important thing to focus on, which that's for me on the disease side of things, that's kind of where I devote a lot of my focus. And if there's many ways to get there, if keto is one of those ways, then once you use it to achieve those health markers, that's when I think now we can talk about or until it's no longer serving you. Like if you're getting to a point where, yeah, this diet sucks, I don't want to do it anymore, then like, yeah, let's go a different route then, right? Yeah. It's like using it to get you to that point, and then saying, I think the best approach for somebody who's going to do keto is, following the keto diet until it's no longer serving you, or until you reach your kind of goal on those health markers, and then transitioning, like learning, using the things you learn. Like one of the benefits is that, and I think you'll get this from any diet, is that you'll learn the importance of whole food. You'll learn the importance of eating protein, not eating processed junk, cutting out added sugars and stuff like that, eating whole foods. So you take the good of that, and then you incorporate that into a more sustainable approach long term. I totally don't think it's sustainable to say somebody's not going to eat carbohydrates for the rest of their life. I haven't done it, and I'm considered the keto guy. So if I can't do it, who else is going to be able to do it? So I think that's the way that I look at it, is that even though it's like I'm considered the keto guy, it's like I believe that it's one lane that you can take, and there's a process to figure out if you should be taking that lane or if you should be taking a completely different one. Because I think we would all agree it's about calories, it's about consuming whole foods, about micronutrients, avoiding certain junk foods and things like that, and then how you get there depending on the individual.
I love the honesty. You heard it from the Ketologist himself that the sustainability may not be there for everyone, and it seems like a thread from both camps here is minimizing processed foods. I feel like if I were to characterize my nutritional habits in the last year, And again, if I bash my fiance before, I will shout her out here. It's one thing that she's been really like key on, and I feel better, and I'm not as hungry, and I think I naturally eat less. And to me, it's kind of synonymous with like reducing snacking. But I try not to buy anything packaged anymore. Sometimes I do. Shout out Perfect bars. Those are my go-to snacks. But would you guys agree that, in addition to the different ways to adopt a healthier lifestyle, whether it's keto or whether it's developing, a sound macronutrient profile through whole foods, that if we're talking about adding or taking away as a first step, would taking away processed foods being a good, solid first step?
Depends on the individual still and their goal, honestly. I wouldn't say that processed food is great, but if you also demonize that and say, oh, I can never have that, I think that can be problematic. So like, I'll use myself as a super quick example. For me to eat at caloric maintenance, pretty darn simple. For me to eat in a calorie deficit, pretty darn simple. For me to be eating in a surplus, it's actually really, really challenging.
Yeah.
So when I am intentionally trying to gain weight, processed food is kind of my best friend in a sense. But I don't say that this is improving my health markers. I'm saying this is helping me reach my goal of gaining weight and hopefully adding mass.
Yeah.
So it's so individualized.
Yeah.
For most people, if they limit their processed food compared to where they're currently at, it's probably going to improve their health, and it's going to force them to replace that with something that is more nutritious, more filling, more voluminous. So yeah, for the most part, yes, but it depends on the individual.
I love it. I teed you up for a black and white answer, and you gave me it depends. And I think we all share one advisor here, Dr. Carlos Ubernich and Eduardo de Saza as well. But the number one answer that you can always give to any question in the scientific field is it depends. And I think that is the essence of what we're trying to get through on this podcast. Is we are not going to say this is good, this is bad, because ultimately it depends. And maybe just I want to give a quick summary on some of the main concepts that we discussed today, and then wrap it up because we're already in over an hour.
Wow.
And then I just will give you both the final question that I want to ask every guest on this podcast. But let me know if I'm right here. If you are an individual who is not in the exercise science field and you don't have a foundation in nutrition and you are looking to adopt a healthier lifestyle, we would recommend that you develop an awareness of how many calories you're consuming. And we think the best way to do this is to, whether it's for a week or for a month, for some period of time, track your food intake, learn how much calories, and identify the sneaky calorically dense foods and the snacks that you can acquire if you're looking to eat a lot of volume. In addition to that, prioritize natural whole food sources, and I think the three of us agree that high quality protein is going to be the way to go. And then you can fill in your proteins and fats per Chris Barakat's recommendation: 2 servings of fruit, 3 servings of vegetables, ideally for throughout the day. Per Chris's recommendation, depending on your baseline insulin sensitivity, that may dictate whether you are someone who can utilize safely and effectively a higher carbohydrate diet, or potentially you're someone who may benefit from everything that a low carb ketogenic diet could offer. Does that seem like some of the main takeaways here?
For sure.
Anything to add before I hit you with the final hammer?
Let me just add one thing. So I spoke about starting with calories, then doing protein. I gave that one recommendation, just so like we know the way I set fat second. So generally speaking, fat can range from anywhere between 20% to 35% of their diet. The less active you are, the higher body fat percent you are. You're going to be closer to the 35%, because that's going to force your carbs to be lower, and you're kind of the low carb advocate, right? If you're very, very lean and very, very active, then drop your fats closer to the 20% range, and then fill in the a larger percent of your calories coming from the carbs. So that's how I approach it. It's very just based on individual activity levels and current body composition, which often relates to how they're tolerating carbs and their insulin sensitivity and resistance anyway.
Yeah.
So we're probably on a similar
Totally.
page.
I think what I love most about that is that we both think that same thing. We have a different mindset of getting there, right? Because you're looking, so body fat percentage, right? So higher body fat percentage, you're kind of going lower carb.
Yeah.
Well, higher body fat percentage means more insulin resistant usually, right? So it's like, it's the same thing, which is why I love that. There's, so definitely agreed.
I love it. Anything to add on a closing note outside of the hammer question that's coming?
I was going to ask it off air, but I do want to ask it now. When you were talking about your protein recommendations, the gram per pound of lean mass, for somebody that's trying to gain muscle, do you set that to what their goal is to get to? Like if I'm, in your example, 160 pounds of lean mass, and I want to get to 180 pounds of lean mass, would I eat to 180 grams of protein, or how do you take that?
Oh yeah, so my personal protein recommendations are insane, and it's not backed by the scientific literature, actually. So that 1 gram per pound of lean mass is like my bare minimum. The same way like the RDA is like 0.8.
Okay.
That's supposed to be the bare minimum according to RDA. My bare minimum is that.
Okay, got
So
it.
it's not even like my true recommendation. That's like where I start relatively sedentary people that aren't used to eating too much protein. It depends person to person, but somebody trying to gain quality muscle and training a lot, it's a lot higher than that.
Okay, got it.
It's actually quite higher than that.
Currently, how many grams of protein does Christopher Barakat ingest in a given day?
Between a minimum of 200 and a maximum of 250.
And what are you currently weighing at?
170.
Roughly how many pounds of lean body
Lean mass,
mass?
probably 155.
Cool.
Yeah, so way higher than that.
I try to maximize the protein as
Yeah.
well, but unfortunately, I think you have about 50 extra pounds of lean mass than me. All right. The final question that we will introduce to every guest on the Physiology and Philosophy podcast is, if you were given a national broadcast and everyone in the United States of America and the entire world, for that matter, was forced to tune in, and you had, we'll say, from 2 to 10 minutes to address the nation and give your expertise on providing healthy recommendations, what would your message be to the world, Christopher Barakat?
I wish I had way more time to think about this and share this. Does it have to be training and nutrition related?
No, fuck it. Anytime I try and tee Chris up with a specific question, he opens up the door.
I might just,
What
somewhere
do you
else.
want to say to the world? Because we have a lot of followers.
This is the first episode, right?
First episode.
Man, I really wish I had a lot more time to think about this, because it's such a good question that I don't want to put out some BS.
Before you answer,
Yeah.
A, I'll give you more time to think about it as I'm speaking. But B, if you wanted to amend your answer tonight and send a video, I will also add that, but I will not delete what you're currently going to say.
I was going to say, yeah, this is written in stone after this.
Okay, I know where I'm going to take this. This is interesting. I'm going to talk quickly about self-belief, okay, instead of training and nutrition necessarily. And I'm not going to say it as if I'm addressing the nation, if that's okay with you, Faith, but
yeah,
I'll do my best.
My fellow Americans.
My fellow Americans. I think something that's really interesting is how your perspective of yourself and your capabilities can change over time. And I think it's really important that, like, every individual, we often put ourselves in a box. So if it is nutrition related, body composition related, you usually think like, this is what I believe I can achieve. You might look at someone else, you say, oh, I can definitely not achieve that. You might look at someone else, oh, I could probably achieve something that they have. And we kind of do this in different aspects of life, academics, business, whatever it may be. I think it's important that people challenge where they currently have their ceiling, and they have projects and goals in their life that are working towards what their current limiting belief is, or where that current ceiling is. Because what I've experienced over the last 10 plus years is, once you achieve a certain goal and reach a certain destination that you once thought was like your maximum, you can actually hang out there relatively easily, because you've increased your work capacity, you've increased your self-belief. So now you're like sitting at this level that at one point you thought was your highest level and what your greatest capabilities would allow you to fulfill. and then you see a higher mountaintop, and your self-belief continues to grow, and then you start walking up that mountaintop, and you eventually attain that. It can take 1, 2, 5, 10 years, but you finally get there, and you're like, damn, I didn't even think I would achieve what I achieved 10 years ago, and now I'm at where I'm at now. So I just think self-belief is something that is really interesting. I think some people that achieve a lot in a really short period of time or at a really young age, it's almost because they were so ignorant and they believed in themselves so much that they didn't have a ceiling that was relatively low. Like, their ceiling was the fucking moon, and they got to the moon so quick, and it was kind of ignorant, but it still got them to a very high height at a very rapid pace. And I just find that very interesting, and I'm trying to continually like challenge my own self-beliefs, limiting beliefs, get past them, and just blow the fucking roof off the thing. Yeah, so I guess that's where my message was going. Do something that challenges yourself. Understand that a lot of your limitations are just whatever you have put upon yourself. A lot of people aren't holding you back. You're usually the person that's holding yourself back more than anybody else out there, any sort of external circumstance. So yeah, that's what I would leave the people with for today.
Yeah, that's great. I love it, because I think that message is actually more important today than it's ever been, because we live in a very comfortable society. Like, even if you're kind of below the poverty threshold, like considering where we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you're still very comfortable, and we have a lot of things that can distract us, and like we can, like, I think as a whole, our generation is, in our generation in particular, and generations younger than us, are moving away from, pushing to become better. It's like we just want to be comfortable. We just want to kind of we want things to be handed to us, and I think that's amazing. Like, break the mold a little bit.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
I love it. I love the message. I also love you as a person, and I appreciate you for sharing that with the nation and the world. Christopher Irvin.
It's tough to follow up.
What's your message? You can keep it direct to nutrition. You can keep it general. I'll also offer you the same criteria with Chris. If you don't have it on the fly and you want to amend it in post-production, I'll add it. I won't cut this part out.
Well, luckily I had time to think about it. Well, I was gonna kind of be funny, and if I was gonna stick nutrition, but also serious, and I think the society needs to hear, of all the diets that we've talked about today, don't be vegan. I was gonna recommend don't be vegan. Eat meat.
Dude, you're gonna get me canceled on my first episode.
But I'm actually gonna go a different route. I think that today we talked about a lot of like nutrition. We talked about exercise. I think one of the biggest missing pieces, and we actually see this like looking historically at like research, but I think it's even more important in today's society, is the importance of community. I think one of the things that we see when we look at like the blue zones that everybody pays attention to, everything's different in the blue zones. The diets that they eat are different. Their lifestyles are a little bit different, but the one thing that seems to be common amongst all those areas is like really strong community. And I actually do think that's one of the reasons why some people do really well with diets, is because they get involved in a community. Like a lot of even fad diets are culty in a way, and you're in a Facebook group now, and you have this community of people that are supporting you, and you're putting out a message of your progress, and everybody's excited for you, and I think that makes a big difference. And I think this was the case even a few years ago with like the development of social media and remote work and all these things, but then especially post-COVID, I think we've all gotten isolated. And not only does it impact our health and our nutrition habits and everything like that, but the impact that has on our mental health, the way we feel day to day, it's pretty profound. So I think like that's as much as we focus, assuming most people who listen to podcasts are probably very self-help focused. They're trying to do things to improve themselves, focusing on their diet, their nutrition, reading books, focusing on developing strong community, surrounding yourself with people who like make you happy, they don't tear you down, they help you become a better person, I think is one of the best things that everybody can do, and we're not doing enough of it.
I love both messages. Chris Irvin, I also love you as a person, and I think you both, in a miraculous way, teed me up perfectly in this sense that this episode was more nutrition based and falls under maybe the physiology component of the podcast, but per the name, I am aware it's not mind and body. There's some connection. So I think, yes, you want to adopt healthy lifestyles, but I also want to talk about developing your own philosophy of life that works for you, because ultimately it's the integration of healthy nutritional and physical habits and a healthy mindfulness habits that can, I think, elevate your life to the fullest extent. So the fact that we ended with a teaser onto some of the content you can find on the philosophy side of this podcast, it gives me chills, and it makes me tingle just to have you two, who I know personally are philosophically aware and into mindfulness practices, but the fact that we dipped our toes into those water gives me confidence that through this channel we can not only expand our expertise on the physical aspects of being healthy, but we can sort of bridge the gap between healthy mind and healthy body. And with that, I will say thank you to all of our viewers who tuned in live for this episode, and tune in next week for episode number 2. And I just want to really thank you both.
Cool.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us for episode 1, man.
Thank you.